Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple. We are back with the tactical analysis of the Premier League encounter between two teams who will be hoping to get their hands on silverware come the end of the season. Lampard's new look side and Klopp's team clashed at Stamford Bridge, and in the end, the match ended 2-0 to Liverpool thanks to goals by Mane, whilst Christensen was sent off for Chelsea. The XG indicated it was a deserved win for Liverpool, 2.69 to 0.92. Although looking at the XG time distribution map, you can see that the bulk of their chances came after the red card. But what tactics did both managers use? Let's take a look. A quick reminder of the formations used by both sides, as seen on the OneFootball app. OneFootball will get you match updates, formation updates, as well as player and team stats, and so much more. And the best part is, you can get it absolutely free through the sponsored link in the description below. Let's start by looking at what Chelsea did on the ball. When Chelsea wanted to play out from the back, they dropped their centre-backs into the box, whilst pushing their full-backs wider and higher. Liverpool consistently looked to press high in the first half and to cut this off at source, with Mane and Salah positioned just outside the box and ready to push on if they tried to play short. Jorginho was tied up by Firmino, who stayed deeper, and whenever Kovacic dropped deeper in these situations to form the double pivot, Keita or Henderson would be ready to push high onto him. So, the only outlets were Reece James and Alonso, but in the first half, Liverpool were willing to play higher risks, with the fullbacks gambling by pushing high up and trying to win it in these zones. For the most part, their presses were successful, even before the sending off, with a much lower passes per defensive action, but of course, the red card did distort these figures. But on the occasions where they were able to bypass the first line of pressure, Liverpool were still aggressive in the press with their midfielders. Kovacic and Jorginho often formed a double pivot, whilst Conte often pushed higher into the right half space, and he and Mount would often rotate positions, trying to get one of them free. Keita on the right was often keen to follow Kovacic into these deeper areas, and Havertz would look to drop deep into the pocket of space created from his centre-forward position to try and get the ball. This was aided because Werner would push from the left into the half space, which would prevent the centre from tracking him into the deep regions. It also often drew Trent more central to try and compensate for the pace of Havertz, and this would then open up Alonso to receive the ball as Salah often stayed higher. It should be noted that at times, Trent will be caught higher up the pitch when he had been attacking, or in situations where he had pushed high to press Alonso. And particularly once Chelsea were behind, they looked for these longer balls into Werner behind the high line of pressure to try and get in on goal, which they did manage a few times. But realistically, once they went behind, they struggled to create for the most part. But how about Liverpool? What did they do with the ball? Well, even when it was 11 versus 11, Chelsea were not that aggressive in their press, instead opting for a mid-block. This meant Liverpool could play expansively with just two centre-backs in the build-up, and the full-backs pushing fairly high and wide early on. Lampard may have opted for more of this 4-5-1 shape in defence so that his wide men could keep their eyes on the Liverpool fullbacks who are key, because pressing with the front three would have only caused an overload in the wide regions. But Chelsea's midfield could be drawn into a press at times, especially on the occasions where Werner and Mount did stay higher up the pitch, and this did create space for Firmino to look to drop into. Instead of using a traditional three-man midfield, Wijnaldum often pushed much higher up into one of the half spaces, whilst Firmino occupied the other. Alternatively, Firmino stayed high as a centre-forward, then Salah would move into the half space. Either way, by keeping their half spaces occupied, it would draw in the Chelsea fullback much more narrow. And importantly, while Mount and Werner did track back, Both of them are not traditional wingers, and at times they would allow their runners off of them. As a result, switches into both wide regions were consistently on, and Liverpool's wide men were one-on-one fairly often. This was only exacerbated once Chelsea were down to 10 men, as initially they switched to somewhat of a 4-3-2 shape with Mount and Havertz high. This naturally meant that the wide regions were free, and the fullbacks, knowing that there was less threat in behind, were able to camp higher up the pitch. Initially, Conte was particularly able to help James out, constantly moving out wide, but Liverpool soon countered this with a central overload, with the wingers coming central into the half spaces as well as Wijnaldum pushing forwards, which then meant that Chelsea had to contract to protect zone 14. So when the ball would be switched and the men were isolated wide, it created more space in the half spaces as the fullbacks move out towards the ball. We see shades of this in Mane's goal. We see that the Chelsea midfield is forced narrow, and this time Trent is deeper while Salah is wide, drawing Alonso and creating space for Firmino in the half space. He receives the ball in the space, and Salah's run now sees him in the half space as well. On the far side, Mane made his run into the box from the half space, and Robertson can back up the play due to less threat in behind him in the wide regions. The cross comes in and Mane finishes well. Overall, it's hard to assess the match as so much was turned by Christensen's red card and a Kepa error that's hard to account for. The first half was fairly even, with few chances created, but the second half was only ever going to end one way. But what did you make of the match? Any other tactics you noticed? A quick note, I mostly covered the parts where the match was 11 versus 11, as it was a better showing of the manager's intentions. But what else did you note, particularly when it was 10 versus 11? A shout out to everyone who's been able to support Football Made Simple on Patreon. If you want early access to content and exclusive content, head on over to patreon.com/footballmadesimple and you could help to support the channel. A special thanks to Faris Sami, Zaki Karetz, Rotimi Ayorinde, Stan, Eduardo Carlsberg, Harold Mendoza, Jordan Rodriguez, Pedro, Tommy, and Neo Gan. But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.